I'm Judy Reagan Craggs, Director of the Dry Ridge Historical Museum. We are pleased to introduce you to the history of Weaverville, from the earliest Native Americans to pioneers who settled the Rims Creek Valley and the town. As we celebrate the 150th anniversary of Weaverville, we hope you will visit the museum to learn more about the history of our town. This is our 150th anniversary. The town was actually chartered in 1875, so it's our 150th anniversary of the official chartering of the town. But I'm going to go way back to help us understand where Weaverville came from. So first, there was the mountains, and what we call the mountain, Hamburg Mountain. This shows a little bit of the town, and it's one of the earliest pictures that we have of the town. So it shows a few of the buildings and things, but what we're really looking at is just that bare mountain up there, and the mountain was here. So we know that the Appalachians are the oldest mountains in the North American continent. Almost 250 million years ago, this mountain settled into its present form. The earliest people were known as Paleo-Indians from about 10 to 13,000 years ago. Then came the woodland people, who were well known in this area, or sometimes we call them the mound builders. And there is an existing mound on the Biltmore property that has not ever been fully excavated. Mound builders were then the ancestors of the Cherokee and the Catawba and other tribes that had no permanent settlements, as far as we know, in our area, but had many trails and hunting grounds. And most of the old roads followed the Indian trails, particularly one in Asheville, where trails crossed, is where Asheville was founded. And the Cherokee tribes date from about 1000 BC. In 1540, DeSoto passed through this area and trying to find gold. Well, he didn't find any gold or anything worthwhile, so he moved on pretty quickly. But he ended up causing mass deaths in the native tribes from measles and smallpox. In the 1500s, the Cherokee Nation encompassed Kentucky, Tennessee, western North Carolina, western South Carolina, and the tip of Alabama. So think about how big the Cherokee Nation and the area that they controlled. And then in 1739, another epidemic from a boat, they think from a boat in Charleston in the port, killed about 1/2 the Cherokee population from smallpox. The British treated with the Cherokee and some of the other tribes, and in return they promised that settlers would not be able to be in this area. There was what was called the Cherokee Line, and our part here was over the Cherokee Line, so settlers were not allowed to come in and settle here, except there were a few land grants given by the Crown for favors or, money to the Crown or something else. So there were a few white settlers in this area at the time. And after the Revolutionary War, the Cherokee had sided with the British. And of course, when the British lost, the Cherokee lost, right? So then the area was open to settlement after that, and primarily in the form of land grants. There were no roads here. The settlers had to follow the rivers and the native trails. There were no access by wagons at first. You had to come in by horseback or by mule. Entrance in the Rims Creek Valley, we think of now of, coming from Asheville all the time, that you're coming this way. But the original road would have been from the Bee Tree settlement or from Swannanoa area over the mountain where kind of the parkway is and down into the Ox Creek area. Also, there was the road wound around. We have learned from the Heron Farm, which is a 200-year farm, that there was a road from Asheville that came around by the Elk Mountain and down into the upper Heron Cove, and that was a way to get into Asheville. So there was no going up Merriman Avenue. You had to come across the mountain in some way. We think that John Weaver actually came down what they call through the Watauga settlement, which would be up around Boone, and came in through the mountains and probably down through Avery and Yancey County and where Burnsville is now, and in that direction, because there's some oral history that talks about him seeing the ridge and the valley. So he probably would have come maybe from a different direction, but of course we don't know that. The very first road in the area was extended from the Ox Creek, for those of you who know, up in the upper end of Rims Creek, down to John Weaver's cabin, which was called Pine Cabin. And so some early families besides the Weavers in the valley were the Vances, as we know. Shadrach Hyatt, I love that name, Shadrach. Shadrach Hyatt had some land about the middle area of Reams Creek. The Bairds were here, the Branks were here, and a number of other families. The Vances actually came a bit after John Weaver. The Devers were the original owners of the land where the Vances settled. And there was also Mr. Rims, R-I-M-S, Mr. Rims. Mr. Rims didn't really own any land, but he was known to hunt in this area and visit with different families, and he was kind of well known. But then one day, some of the Weaver enslaved people were working, and they heard these cries and commotion going on. And then they thought, well, maybe it was some of the Cherokee or somebody passing through doing something, and they didn't pay much attention. But then later, up near the creek, they found the body of Mr. Rims, shot through with arrows. Generally, the settlers had good relationships with the native people, but in this case, we don't know what Mr. Rims did or didn't to upset them. And because he was near the creek, or maybe even part of the creek, we're not sure, they named the creek Rims Creek, R-I-M-S. And in the early documents, you will see R-I-M-S. But then in one of the censuses or something, the way people pronounced it here, they wrote it down R-E-E-M-S, Reams. So you'll hear people say either Rims or Reams Creek. In 1775, North Carolina issued bounty land warrants to veterans of the Revolutionary War. The grants could range anywhere from 274 to 640 acres. We suppose that John Weaver was a veteran because he received one of the grants, but we actually have no proof. We do know that he came to the valley with John and Jacob Biffle, and we have documentation that they were veterans of the Revolutionary War. We also know that he married their sister, so that it makes sense that he met them sometime during the war. So Elizabeth Biffle lived over in what is now Tennessee. It was still part of North Carolina then, in what they called Happy Valley, or the state of Franklin, where they were trying to become independent in the eastern part of Tennessee there. And Elizabethton was already a fairly decent-sized settlement, so there were people there. She was used to being kind of in a village and a larger family. And here came John. She was 12 years old, and John came, and they got married. He was probably in his early 20s, maybe a hardened soldier, from the war. So it must have been I think of Elizabeth a lot, must have been quite an experience for her. But they were married in Happy Valley in 1785 when she was 12 years old. John had gotten his land grant, remember, in 1785. So my theory is, and this is just my theory, is that he left Elizabeth with her family, came here to start building his cabin on his land that he had gotten, and maybe put in crops and things like that. Elizabeth was pregnant by that time, so then he went back some people say he came here in the fall of 1786, and some people say in the spring of 1787. My theory is it was the spring because Jacob was born in September, and I don't think it makes sense that John went and got them and brought a new baby across the mountain with a mule and a horse, Also, there wouldn't have been crops, later in the winter. There's also an oral family history that they encountered a late snow in April when coming across the mountain. So that says to me, that he came in the spring. But anyway, they came here, and they had 11 children eventually, 10 of whom survived. And the Vance family by then was coming about 1791. I always kind of imagine Elizabeth, like I said, I think of her a lot, coming by horse with a mule carrying whatever belongings of hers they could carry. And she's in the wilderness. There was forest, there were wild animals, there were Cherokee and Catawba and other people moving through the area. It must have been really daunting, when you had to just establish someplace and no near neighbors. Even if your neighbors were a couple of miles up the road, that was a long way with no road. So And Asheville was not founded until 1793, so Asheville was not there. It was first called Morristown, after one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So Pine Cabin was established down, and John Weaver's first cabin, which we don't really have a picture of, was where the Frontier Phone Company is now on Rims Creek. If you turn left from Hillside right onto Rims Creek, the Frontier Phone Company is right there. And that was where we have been able to place John's very first cabin. This is not John Weaver's cabin. We don't have a picture of it. But this is the Hemp Hill cabin, which would have been very similar to the one he would have built at the time. We have the axe in the museum and his foot adze, where he actually shaped the logs for his first cabin. And then a few businesses started to spring up on the ridge over here. I guess they decided it was just a good place to be. There was also some flat land down through here. So businesses would have been a blacksmith, tanneries, things that were needed, by the settlers, and eventually a general store. And all of these were built by enslaved workers. So we really have our black families and some of their descendants that are still here to thank for most of the building and the work of the town. The Vance birthplace has established that a lot of most of the blacksmiths here were loaned out to different places, but were almost all enslaved workers. The first church was a Methodist church established in 1805, where the old Weaverville Cemetery is on Main Street. We believe that this here is that church. You're looking at Main Street going south down this way. So we're looking at this church. The church and the cemetery were actually located in kind of a difficult place. There was a place called the Ball Mountain Road that ran on the ridge and apparently kind of interfered with that area of town. So they actually moved the church down here. The church was just first a log church, but then they built a church, but then they actually moved the church down here to the campground. There was also a small cemetery down here on the campground. The Biffle Mill is also located where our the red wheel, was located, was the Biffle Mill. That was the earliest mill in the area. It was built in 1790. And so the mill was there. There was a really good spring, apparently, a big spring that was covered over by Merriman over here now. But there was a good place for people to meet. So they started meeting on the campground. The Biffles are buried under the lake. Their graves were probably just had field stones on them, and when they did the lake, they could not find them. So there is a old millstone marker down by the flagpole at the lake that you can see that commemorates the Biffles. At one point, there were as many as 11 mills on the river. This is actually the Lot Speech Mill, but it was very similar to the Biffle Mill. And they were grist mills, corn. They were sawmills, a lot of them. There was even a woolen mill where the Weaverville Milling Company building originally was a woolen mill. John Cairn came here from Scotland with equipment because he was familiar, of course, with sheep and everything in Scotland and equipment, and he ran the woolen mill. He really did not like running the woolen mill. He was really more interested in birds. You may have heard that John Cairn was an ornithologist, a bird expert. When the woolen mill was done, Mrs. Vanderbilt bought the looms from the mill. And those looms are in one of the displays near the Grove Park Inn and the little shops, that the weaving shop and so forth. It's because she was teaching local women crafts and how to make an income. The first post office was the McClure Post Office, founded in 1896. There was also a post office up at Vanceville, which the area around the Vance birthplace was called Vanceville. And this was on the McClure property, and ironically, it is about where the post office is today. And there's also a little cemetery, if you've ever noticed, near the post office down to the left, there's still a little cemetery right in there, too. Jacob Weaver, the oldest son of John, as I mentioned, became a Methodist minister, and so did Monterville, my third great-grandfather. Jacob built one of the more modern homes in the community in 1834, and this home still exists up on Rims Creek It's built in 1834. And if you looked where the Pold Hereford sign is, if you look back in there, especially now before all the leaves come out, you can still see the house sitting back in there. It's been abandoned for many years. Jacob also established the Weaver reunions, which started in 1858 and still take place in August to this day. So children of the original settlers began to spread out through the valley and up on the ridge. And in 1850 brought James Americus Reagan to the campground. James Americus came to the campground. This is a picture of the lake, but this is what the campground would have looked like, this flat area here. And he was an itinerant Methodist circuit rider. He was based over in Tennessee. Tennessee was a state by then. And he would ride over the mountain, and in the winter it got very cold. Some people say he might have gotten frozen to the saddle and they had to go out and pour warm water over the stirrups to get him out of the saddle. Yeah, you can imagine, up on those mountains, it was not really pleasant. But he came here with a friend, and they were preaching down here at the campground. You could just imagine them standing over there preaching. And Mary Ann Elizabeth Weaver was there with her friend Martha Van Diver, or Vanderveer, as a lot of people say. And they were looking at these two guys. Now remember, everybody here were pretty family or pretty close. So apparently, supposedly, Mary Ann looks at Dr. James and says, "I'll take that one, and you can have the other." And she did. They were married within the year. She went out to get him. And Martha took a little longer, but she eventually did marry the other guy too. So James and Mary Ann Elizabeth were married in 1850. They built their house on the north end of Main Street in 1851. The house still exists behind Main Street. It's almost at the corner of Main Street and Weaver Boulevard. If you look and see the greenhouse that's right on the corner, that's Dr. Latta Reagan, his son, but his house is next door. They moved it when they built Weaver Village. They moved the house up toward Main Street, so you don't see it, but it's been actually renovated over the years. It was used for storing hay when I was growing up for a while, and because nobody wanted it. All the women after World War II wanted modern homes. They didn't want these old farmhouses, that had no amenities. But the house still stands, and was used as a summer home for many years, and we have reunions over there too. James Americus then got tired of being a circuit rider and having children. They had 9 children. And so he went back to school and became a doctor. So he was one of the towns. There were several doctors, interestingly enough. The town attracted a lot of doctors, it seems. But he went to medical school and delivered 886 babies, according to his handwritten journal that we have copies of in the museum, which is very, very interesting. Dr. Reagan also established one of the first stores, which is on the corner where the Methodist Fellowship Hall is today. It was a store, and he had a small pharmacy there. And behind the store was the Yoder Pottery, and there was a number of famous potters in the area. Yoder taught Donkel some, and there are a lot of fairly famous pottery. So the red clay was pretty good for doing pottery. J.W. Van Diver also opened up a general store where Blue Mountain Pizza is today, and that is the oldest commercial building still in service in western North Carolina. If you walk around the back, you can look at some of the foundation and appreciate how old that building is. The Van Diver home was initially where the Weaver house is right now, on that corner. And then it became the Ramage house when he built his house. Recognize that house? That is the lawyer's offices by the Shope building. Yeah. And it still, of course, has been continually lived in since he built it. So he had the general store. The general store, of course, didn't have the signage up on it, but this is one of the older pictures that we have. And you can see this is before the addition. There was one little addition. There have been 2 additions put on the sides since then. This was the original building, but if you look at this, the top of the building, you will recognize that part of the building. It was the Weaverville Feed and Seed at one point. So the Vandiver store was there, and it was the largest store in town. There was also apparently at one point a mercantile other general store where the Sprinkle House was, where directly across from Yellow Mug, that two-story house that sits right there, was actually a store at one point also. So then eventually the Civil War came to the area. Of course, it didn't affect physically Weaverville, but of course a lot of the men were in the war, both in the Confederacy and the Union. It split families here just like it did everywhere. There are several unknown Confederate soldiers buried in the old cemetery. There's a bench commemorating that. Also down here at the campground, they brought a lot of veterans, Confederate soldiers or prisoners, I'm not sure which, that were ill, and treated them down here in an encampment down by the lake. Captain W.E. Weaver went to war in the Confederacy, and he took with him Gilbert Baird, his enslaved servant. It's likely that Gilbert was given to Captain Weaver by Eliza Jane Baird, who was Montrevel Weaver's wife, who owned him at the time. Gilbert was often called Uncle Gilbert by everybody in town. He came back to the village after the war as a free man, and he started a brick business. He was said to have owned the first piano in Weaverville, it was told to us by Carl Teague, and the first home comfort stove. Home comforts, if you look them up, were a fancy wood stove. They had a lot of bells and whistles on the wood stove, the warmers and all those kind of things. So the black community settled after the war in the south end of town. Some started their own businesses, some sharecropped with their former owners. Some ran the businesses they had worked at before emancipation, as they just continued on as they had. And some, of course, left the area and moved on. So by 1873, Montrevel, who was, again, the youngest son of John and Elizabeth, and Dr. Reagan, envisioned a larger town, a more prosperous town. Montrevel said, people need a reason to stay here. We need a reason for the young people to come back here, like a lot of towns say, right? And so Montrevel had all this land, the land that you're sitting on, the land all the way up to the north, to the top of the mountain. And he said, I'd like to live in town. I'm tired of farming. I'm the youngest son, I want to live in town. So he built a log cabin about where the parking lot is now, with the clock, the parking lot in town. But some people say it was a double log cabin. We think that means he may have had a mother-in-law suite, because his mother-in-law moved in with him later. But anyway, Montrevel inherited that land. And so he went and stood in front of the Vandiver General Store, the store, and said, okay, I'm going to donate half a mile in each direction. That's our town. And Main Street is going to be 1 mile long, half mile this way, half mile this way. And we have this map, which is out here in the case. If you measure it from Weaver Boulevard down to the grammar school, that is about a mile. That still is a mile. So that is our Main Street. You can barely see on this map, but this said Dr. Vandiver's dwelling, his house, Dr. Vandiver's store, which had eventually moved over here where the blacksmith shop is. But anyway, there was a shoe shop, a tin shop, a spring house, a few cabins, Montrevel Weaver's house right here, just gardens, stables, and so forth. That's all there was in the town at that time. They started to block off, you'll see on the ends of this particular map, some lots, and they were selling lots for like $10, $15, encourage people to move to the town. Montrevel also said he was going to donate 5 acres for a good school. There had been a temperance school over on College Street, but the temperance school burned down during or right after the war. So we had no official schools. There were subscription schools where you could pay 50 cents or $1 or something in someone's home to go to school, that sort of thing. We had no official schools, particularly after 7th or 8th grade. There was no school here. So they wanted a good school. And so people were standing around and they said, well, Montrevel, I guess since you're donating all this land and you're a Weaver, guess what? We have to call the town Weaverville, right? So the town didn't receive its official, this was in 1873 when Montreal gave the land. It was officially chartered. Oh, and we don't have a picture of Montreal, but we do have a picture of his wife. This is Eliza Jane Baird, Montreal's wife. And the town was officially chartered on March 16th, 1875. So that's why it's our 150th anniversary. And this is the handwritten charter, and I have some copies up here if anybody would like to take one. There's also a typed up copy in the case that you can actually read really well. But the town was chartered, and then the population was about 200 in the 1880 census. I think it was actually 187, something like that. Dr. Reagan became the first mayor of the town. He was the first president of the college and the first Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge. And I think that was just because he was one of the more educated people in town. Also, he was Montreal's son-in-law, so there you go. Weaver College was notable in that it was co-ed right from the beginning. Women were admitted equally with men, so which in 1875, that would have been a really unusual thing. Mars Hill College had already been established by then. It was a Baptist school. It was small. Weaver College, as you can see, had a rather grand, this was the administration building, which no longer exists, and the classroom building. There are other buildings on College Street that still exist, the girls' dorm, the boys' dorm, and the president's home. The bricks were furnished by, and remember I said that Uncle Gilbert had a brick making business, and Uncle Gilbert made most of the bricks for the college. And apparently some of the bricks, they hurried at the end and had to go get, there's a story about their having to go actually take down some rail fences to get enough wood to fire the brick. And so some of those bricks were probably not fired quite properly, and the administration building eventually was kind of crumbling, and it was kind of an unwieldy building, so it was actually torn down and where the Masonic Lodge is now. This is just a picture of some of the Weaver College students. The gay blades they look like at the time. I don't know. They're an interesting group of guys. But we have that in 1905 that was documented. We have the contrast between the college with its brick, beautiful buildings and the colored school. This is the Hillside School, and this was the one-room school that was attended for many years by the black groups of the community. This is a picture of Dr. Reagan about the time that he was president of the college. This is Dr. Reagan's home. It looks kind of different now than it did then. The upstairs area here was made into a bathroom. So they took down the balcony and made that little hallway that's behind there a bathroom. There were 2 rooms. It was a typical dog trot kind of house. The master bedroom, or the big bedroom here, living room and dining room on this side, little added on kitchen on the back. The original kitchen probably would have been in an outbuilding. And then upstairs, two rooms, 1 girls, 1 boys, like a dormitory. And it actually did not come out on Main Street originally, even though it was right near Main Street. You'll notice there's Reagan Street that goes off Church Street. It came down through the field, and there was a pond and around to the actual Methodist church that was on Main Street at the time. So the town began to grow. A lot of businesses. 1905, the time when the college was really going, and a picture of those boys were taken, electricity came to town. The electric company was formed. John Erskine came here, and he really took off with the electric and telephone business. He greatly expanded it. His granddaughter, Pat Sawyer, tells a story about going with him up on the hills and around and in the valley everywhere, and he would go to evaluate and see if they could get to a house to bring the electricity or the telephone to the house. So Weaverville began to be a really modern town with telephone, electricity, and then the people in the town started petitioning the town to have a water and sewer service. So they actually did go through and get water and sewer from the watershed up above Eller Cove, where the actual watershed is now, which they're making a green space, right, and things up there, and brought water and sewer to the people that live just in the immediate downtown area. Churches began to be built. Of course, this is a picture before the road was paved. This would have been the Dr. Reagan store area where I pointed out where actually Stan McLean's garage, where the fellowship hall is now, across from the Methodist Church. And you can see this is an unpaved road. This is looking north. This is the same road looking south. So you can see by this time, most of the buildings that we identify as being downtown were existing on the street here. You can see the sidewalks are paved, but the road still is not paved. The trolley also came to town. Trolley came to town. In 1909, the trolley line from Asheville was actually completed to Weaverville. And Asheville was the very first city in the state to have a full trolley service, which is really interesting. And why they actually built a line out to Weaverville, we are not totally sure, but probably because of the college. This is Rex Howland, and you can see barely on the front of the car it says the Weaverville line. The depot was about where the traffic light is downtown near the laundromat. And this is an actual picture. You can see again the Weaverville line on the trolley, and all the people dressed to get on the trolley. One of the favorite things later with the trolley, this was later when the lake had already been formed, and this says, you'll notice, Lake Juanita Dance Pavilion. The lake was first called Lake Juanita, and then Lake Louise, because Mr. Moore's wife and his name Louise, and he owned the lake for a time. Anyway, this pavilion went out into the lake, and you can see that there was a pavilion here, and the favorite date for people was to get on the trolley in Asheville, come out to Weaverville, of all things, and listen to music and dance at the pavilion. That was a big-time date, on Friday or Saturday night. Yeah, the trolley continued to operate till about 1922. And by 1922, there were a lot more cars, right? And the Holcomb bus line had started giving service from Weaverville to Asheville. Things just ran as far as Weaverville. They didn't get as far as Mars Hill. There was a sign that said, if you were a college student, you could get the train to Asheville. Then you could continue on to Weaverville. But then if you had to go to Mars Hill, they had to send a wagon to pick you up. So, anyway, but by 1922, there was a big accident on the trolley line. There was a mistake on the switching, and two trolleys collided head-on. And one of the drivers was killed, and there was a lawsuit, and so there was a big to-do. And so they discontinued the trolley line at that point. So 1910 to 1920 were really busy years for the town. And think of all the things that were going on. There were several boarding houses by then. There was, for tourists, Weaverville's always been a tourist town, believe it or not, because of its healthful area in the mountains. There was a sanatorium at the base of the mountain for TB patients run by Reverend Homer Casto, who was a retired Methodist minister. The Nichols Hotel had come. It was located, it was the very first hotel. It was located about where Wellbred Bakery is now. The West Hotel was a wooden hotel, and it burned down eventually. But the Wests were, along with Mr. Erskine, were really entrepreneurs in town. The Wests had a hotel, they had a cafe, they had started the funeral home business with caskets, all that that went with it. They had the Gaffer's gas station. So they really built up the businesses in the town. Then later in the 19-teens, remember, World War I started in 1914. In 1916 was the Great Flood in Asheville, the first Great Flood in Asheville, which also affected Weaverville. 1918 was the flu epidemic. So there was a lot of kind of tragic things. The town kind of stagnated a little bit during that time. So they were really difficult years. So in 1920, the town really wanted to pave that road. They just thought, to be a modern town, we have to have a paved road, right? But they didn't have any money to pave the road. So they had this idea. We're going to talk to Buncombe County and see if they would pave our road. Well, Buncombe County said, well, you're a town, you are responsible. And they said, we'll unincorporate the town. So that's what they did. They gave the town back to the county in 1920, and they had to change the name, too. So they said, Elkwood sounds really classy. We're going to call it Elkwood. So the road got paved, and later in 1921, they took the town back again. And everyone said, Elkwood that's just not right. It's Weaverville. Everybody still calls it Weaverville. So Weaverville it has been. So the population by that time was 606 in the 1920 census. 606. But of course, we're talking about just small town limits. Basically, the town, Main Street, the half mile each direction was what the town was. 1922 brought churches. The Methodist Church had been established, as we discussed. At one point in 1912, there were two churches on Church Street, a Missionary Baptist Church and a Methodist Church, which is where the parsonage is now, about the middle of Main Street. And then they built, of course, the new Methodist Church on the end of Main Street, where it is now. The Presbyterian Church on Alabama was in 1922. And also the Baptist Church was formed. They actually didn't get into their building until a little bit later on. Jan Lawrence told the story about plans being made for the Baptist Church in her mother's kitchen. So the Baptists needed a church. And incidentally, when they were having dancing down here, the Baptists could not participate, of course. So Main Street, this is the West Gas Station. This is a nice picture, too, with the West truck. You see the West service station truck, which would early tow truck. The pumps, the Quaker State Oil, and you can see the pumps look like this, the old pumps. And again, you can see the building next door. Rodney's, which is Rodney's now. Yeah, that gas station has existed pretty much in its present form ever since the early 1900s. Yes, it's well over 100 years old. And this is, of course, the drugstore, which was built in 1917. A lot of the brick buildings on Main Street were built. This was the drugstore built in 1917, which is Well-Bred Bakery now. And this is W.M. Reagan, who is also, that's misspelled Reagan. Reagan's R-E-A-G-A-N. But anyway, this house is where Montreville's original log cabin was. It was where the parking lot is now. It was still existing when I was growing up. It was a really, really nice house, and it is now the clock in the parking lot. So we've come all the way through the 1920s, and that is our town. Questions?